Okay, there's a genuinely significant contradiction sitting at the center of tonight's news that I don't think got nearly enough attention in the coverage circulating right now, so let's start there before working through everything else. The Minnesota cyber attack itself is real and well documented across multiple outlets, including the Washington Post, the New York Times, and ABC News. More than 30 municipal water systems across Minnesota were hit by a coordinated cyber attack targeting their operational technology, specifically the programmable logic controllers that manage physical equipment at water treatment facilities over the weekend of Sunday and Monday this past week, U.S. Intelligence agencies have assessed that Iran was likely behind it. And CISA, the Federal Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, issued a fresh advisory warning that threat actors are targeting these systems specifically to modify passwords and lock out the operators who normally run them. No drinking water was contaminated, and Minnesota IT Services said residents weren't directly impacted, though at least one city asked residents to conserve water for a few hours while officials worked out what was happening. And CISA's advisory noted the broader pattern has resulted in boil water notices and sustained manual operation of affected systems elsewhere in similar incidents. Here's the important caveat multiple outlets are careful to include that I think deserves real weight. Officials explicitly cautioned this assessment is preliminary, not definitive, and the New York Times specifically reported that officials warned the hackers could be attempting to pose as Iran-based specifically to inflame tensions between the two countries during an active war, though former intelligence officials described that particular scenario as unlikely. I want to sit with that possibility for a second rather than rushing past it, because it's a genuinely important piece of the puzzle. In the middle of an active, ongoing military conflict, a cyber attack that gets attributed to Iran, whether accurately or not, carries real weight in shaping public opinion and policy, regardless of who actually did it. Which means the attribution question here matters enormously and deserves more caution than either dismissing it or accepting it outright. Now, here's the contradiction I mentioned at the top, and I think it's the single most newsworthy thing that happened today on this specific story. President Trump himself publicly rejected his own administration's intelligence assessment. At Friday's cabinet meeting at Camp David, when asked about the cyber attack, Trump said, quote, "We heard in Minnesota there was a cyber attack and they blame it on Iran. I don't think so. I think I blame it on Minnesota because they're grossly incompetent." He went on to specifically blame Minnesota's governor, calling him corrupt, rather than accepting the Iran attribution his own intelligence agencies and CISA had put forward. I think that's genuinely remarkable and worth building a real story around, because it's not a minor aside, it's the sitting president publicly contradicting a preliminary intelligence assessment about an attack on American critical infrastructure during an active war with the country being blamed, in favor of a domestic political target instead. Whatever you make of the underlying truth about who actually conducted this attack, and I think the honest answer right now is genuinely uncertain given how preliminary the assessment is, the fact that Trump chose to publicly dismiss the Iran attribution, rather than use it to build the case for continued military pressure, the way you might expect given his rhetoric throughout the rest of this war, tells you something real about how unpredictable and sometimes contradictory the messaging coming out of this administration has been on any given day. I think that detail deserves to be the actual headline of tonight's cyber attack story, more than the attack itself, because it's the piece that's genuinely surprising and underreported, not the fact of an Iran-linked cyber attack on U.S. infrastructure, which, as we'll get to, fits a well-documented, years-long pattern rather than representing something unprecedented. On that pattern specifically, it's worth adding real context, because Iran's interest in targeting American water infrastructure isn't new and didn't start with this war. The Justice Department charged a group of Iranian hackers back in 2016 over a cyber attack targeting a small dam near New York City, and federal cybersecurity officials have been warning for months, independent of this specific war, that Iranian-linked actors have been probing internet-connected industrial control systems at American water, wastewater, and energy facilities. A cybersecurity expert from the firm Dragos told the Washington Post that these attacks have generally targeted what he called very low-hanging fruit, small utilities using default passwords with controllers directly exposed to the internet, rather than sophisticated, hardened targets. Which tells you this isn't really a story about Iran achieving some new, alarming technical capability. It's a story about persistent, opportunistic probing of chronically under-resourced small-town infrastructure that's been going on for years and happens to be getting renewed attention because of the current war. A threat intelligence expert from Sublime Security offered a genuinely useful framing of the likely goal here, too, telling the Post that Iran's aim seems to be psychological rather than actual sabotage, with two audiences in mind, the American public, to stoke anxiety and turn sentiment against the war's costs, even though U.S. systems have proven fairly resilient in practice, and separately, Iran's own domestic audience, to project strength and capability back home. That's a useful lens for understanding why an attack that caused no actual contamination and only minor temporary disruption still generates this much coverage. The value of an attack like this to whoever conducted it is measured substantially in fear and headlines, not in the physical damage actually inflicted, which is exactly why getting the attribution and the details right matters so much. An overclaimed or misattributed story about this kind of attack does some of the attacker's psychological work for them, regardless of who's actually responsible. I want to go back and add more detail to the CISA advisory itself, because the technical specifics actually matter for understanding how serious this class of attack really is. CISA's alert describes threat actors specifically targeting programmable logic controllers, the small industrial computers that physically operate valves, pumps, and other equipment at water treatment facilities, and modifying their passwords specifically to lock legitimate operators out of their own systems. That's a meaningfully different and in some ways more concerning tactic than simply crashing a system or stealing data. Locking operators out of physical infrastructure controls means facility staff have to fall back on manual operation, physically overriding or bypassing the compromised digital controls, which is exactly why CISA's advisory specifically ties this pattern to the boil water notices and sustained manual operations mentioned in the broader warning. It's also worth remembering this isn't the first time this exact pattern has played out at American water utilities. Back in 2023, Iranian-linked hackers targeted a series of small water authorities in Pennsylvania using nearly identical tactics, targeting internet-connected programmable logic controllers manufactured by a specific Israeli company, in an attack widely understood at the time to be motivated as much by the equipment's Israeli origin as by any interest in the water utilities themselves. That 2023 case is genuinely useful context because it shows this specific pattern, targeting under-resourced small utilities with default password, internet-exposed controllers, isn't a new capability Iran developed specifically for this current war. It's a persistent, low-cost tactic that's been part of Iran's cyber toolkit for years, opportunistically deployed against exactly the kind of soft, poorly resourced targets that small American municipalities, without the budget or staff for robust cybersecurity, consistently represent. I also want to add a bit more texture to the IRGC power dynamics specifically, since the names involved matter for understanding how this actually functions day to day. Ahmad Vahidi, the IRGC commander who reporting from earlier this year identified as the central figure in this shift, has reportedly secured backing from Mohammad Bagher Zolgadar, who was installed as Secretary of Iran's Supreme National Security Council back in March after his predecessor, the influential power broker Ali Larijani, was killed, with President Pezeshkian reportedly forced into that appointment by IRGC pressure despite objections from other civilian officials. That's a real specific chain of events, not a vague assertion of IRGC influence, a named commander, a named ally installed into one of the country's most powerful security positions, and a documented instance of a sitting president being overruled on a personnel decision. And it's exactly the kind of granular detail that makes the broader IRGC is in control thesis considerably more credible than if it rested purely on general characterizations without any of the underlying specifics. On the deterrence question raised in tonight's competitor coverage, whether the U.S. should respond to Iranian cyber attacks with cyber attacks of its own, I think it's worth taking seriously as a real policy debate rather than dismissing it, but also worth noting the genuine complications. Offensive cyber operations against Iranian infrastructure carry their own significant escalation risk and blowback potential, and unlike a conventional airstrike, cyber attacks are notoriously difficult to calibrate precisely. An operation aimed at disrupting Iranian military command and control systems can inadvertently spread into civilian infrastructure in ways that are hard to predict or contain in advance, given how interconnected modern digital systems tend to be, even when they're not supposed to be. The U.S. has a documented history of offensive cyber operations against Iran already, including the well-known Stuxnet operation targeting Iran's nuclear centrifuges more than a decade ago, so the idea of cyber retaliation isn't hypothetical or untested. But each new operation in an active shooting war carries meaningfully higher escalation stakes than covert operations conducted during peacetime, since any attributed American cyber strike right now would be read by Iran, fairly or not, as one more front in an already active multi-domain conflict rather than a discrete, deniable covert action. Because I want to be fair here in a way I think the competitor coverage wasn't quite fair to itself. The claim that the IRGC has effectively seized control of Iran's decision-making, sidelining the civilian officials the U.S. has been trying to negotiate with, is real, and CNN's Zachary Cohen did report exactly that this week. But I want to add the context that actually makes this story make more sense. This isn't a brand new revelation that just broke today. It's the latest confirmation of a pattern that's been building and getting reported for months. Back in April, the New York Post and the Institute for the Study of War were already reporting that IRGC Commander Ahmad Vahidi and his allies had assumed a dominant leadership role, sidelining Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi, specifically after he'd indicated willingness to reopen the Strait of Hormuz, with hardliners overruling him. By May, the New York Times had published a detailed profile identifying the actual individuals involved, describing a tight, hardened group of IRGC veterans, men whose formative experience was the brutal 8-year Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s, effectively running the country's decision-making around and above the country's nominal civilian leadership, including President Pezeshkian, who the Times reported had been effectively blocked from key decisions since as early as March. So, when tonight's competitor coverage frames this as a bombshell he predicted months ago while the mainstream media lagged behind, I think the more accurate picture is that this has actually been reported in real, specific detail by mainstream outlets, the Institute for the Study of War, the New York Post, and the New York Times among them for several months now. And this week's CNN piece is best understood as an update and reconfirmation of an already well-established narrative, not the media catching up to something only alternative commentary had previously identified. That's worth knowing because it changes how you should weigh the claim. It's not a single source of speculation. It's a consistent, multiply-sourced assessment that's held up and deepened over months of reporting from several separate outlets, which actually makes it more credible, not less, than if it had just appeared for the first time this week. There's also a specific, on-the-record Trump quote from this same reporting that I think adds real texture to how the administration itself understands this dynamic. In the Oval Office this week, discussing the Iranian strikes on U.S. positions, Trump said plainly, "It was a different group than we're dealing with. They've already apologized." Whoa, that's Trump himself explicitly acknowledging the exact fracture CNN's reporting describes, that the people launching strikes and the people nominally negotiating with Washington may not be operating under unified command, which is a genuinely revealing admission because it suggests the administration's own read on why this war keeps failing to move toward resolution isn't simply that Iran is lying or stalling uniformly. It's that Iran may not currently have a single, coherent decision-making authority capable of making and enforcing an agreement at all, which is a substantially more complicated and harder problem to solve diplomatically than dealing with a unified but dishonest negotiating partner. On the broader camp, David comments, the quotes in tonight's competitor's script check out accurately against the available reporting. Trump discussing losing faith in the Iranians because of the Jordan missile strikes that interrupted an active negotiation, giving Iran credit for continuing to resist, despite having what he described as no navy and no air force left, and saying he expects Iran to get weaker over time, even if there's some continued back and forth in the near term. Those are all consistent, plausible characterizations of a president managing a long, grinding conflict without a clean resolution in sight, and I don't have any specific corrections to offer there. The framing in tonight's competitor coverage of those particular quotes is reasonably accurate. On the Strait of Hormuz status, CENTCOM's position that the strait remains technically open for commercial shipping while acknowledging that ships aren't moving because operators don't want to risk being attacked is also consistent with everything we've tracked across this entire series, a waterway that's legally and technically passable but functionally avoided, which is a genuinely different and more precise description than either fully open or completely closed. And I think it's worth continuing to hold onto that more accurate framing rather than collapsing it into either extreme. On the general preparedness advice raised in tonight's competitor coverage, having basic supplies on hand and being ready for short-term utility disruptions, I think that's genuinely reasonable, ordinary household resilience advice that holds up regardless of whether any specific cyber attack ever succeeds at scale. The same kind of preparedness anyone would reasonably keep on hand for a winter storm or a regional power outage, and it's worth passing along without needing to inflate the current threat level to justify it. Where I'd push back gently is on the framing that this cyber attack specifically demonstrates an urgent, escalating new vulnerability, rather than a continuation of a years-long, generally low success rate pattern that happened, this time, to get unusually high-profile coverage because of the war's backdrop, and because more than 30 systems were affected in a single coordinated wave, rather than the more isolated, single utility incidents we've seen in the past. The scale here is real and worth noting. 30-plus systems in one coordinated attack is larger than the 2023 Pennsylvania case. But the actual outcome, no contamination, minimal disruption, systems restored through manual operation, is consistent with the broader historical pattern of these attacks, causing more alarm than actual physical harm. Stepping back across everything covered tonight, I think the real story isn't any single dramatic claim. It's the accumulating picture of a war being fought and managed by two governments that are each, in their own way, struggling with internal coherence, an American administration whose president is willing to publicly contradict his own intelligence community's preliminary findings in favor of a domestic political target, and an Iranian government where the people negotiating and the people fighting may not be answering to the same chain of command at all. Neither of those dynamics is new exactly. We've touched on threads of both across earlier updates in this series, but seeing them both surface so clearly on the same day is a useful reminder that the biggest obstacle to this war actually ending may not be any specific unresolved dispute over the Strait of Hormuz or Iran's nuclear program. It may simply be that neither side currently has the kind of unified, coherent decision-making apparatus that a genuine, lasting negotiated settlement would actually require to hold. The Minnesota cyberattack is real. The Iran attribution is a genuine but explicitly preliminary intelligence assessment. And the most newsworthy development isn't the attack itself, which fits a well-established, years-long pattern of Iranian probing of vulnerable small-town infrastructure. It's that the president publicly rejected his own administration's attribution in favor of blaming a domestic political opponent, a genuinely unusual and underreported wrinkle. The IRGC control story is real and well-supported, but it's not new information from this week. It's the continuation of a consistent narrative that's been building since at least April across multiple credible, separately sourced outlets. And Trump's own comments this week actually corroborate the specific mechanism CNN describes, a fractured Iranian command structure, where the people fighting and the people negotiating may not be fully coordinated. And the Camp David quotes and the Hormuz status both check out accurately against the broader reporting. I think the through line connecting all of tonight's stories more than any single headline is a war that's increasingly difficult to manage cleanly, precisely because neither side, the American administration navigating contradictory public messaging about attribution and threats, nor Iran's own fractured internal command structure, is currently operating with the kind of unified, predictable decision-making that would make a negotiated resolution straightforward. And that structural uncertainty on both sides is probably a bigger factor in why this war keeps dragging on without resolution than any single tactical development on any given day.